All right, well, we'll get started then. Good evening. Welcome to a snowy Foxborough, Mass. tonight. It's great to be here. My name is Dean Cavaretta. I'll be your moderator for tonight. I'm a member of Common Core Forum. I'm also a certified social studies teacher. I was dual certified by the Massachusetts Department of Secondary and Elementary Education in 2003. I've taught in the Acton, Foxborough, and Concord Carlisle public schools. I've done 8th grade, 9th grade, and every grade up to 12 in the public schools. I've coached at the high school football and lacrosse, and I've certainly lived the life as an educator of education reform, both here in the Commonwealth and what's going on nationally. It's great to be here. We've done several of these, actually more than several. Our goal in having these forums is to talk about education reform. What is Common Core? How does that impact Massachusetts schools? And most importantly, how does that impact the kids? With that, we look forward to a very lively discussion. We try to air all sides and listen to our distinguished panelists. What I'll do is I'll introduce our speakers. I'll give you a sense of what our order is going to be, and we'll get started. So with that, I want to introduce who will be our speaker number one. Jamie Gass is from the Pioneer Institute. Jamie is from the director of the Center for School Reform at the Pioneer Institute. Jamie has framed, commissioned, and managed over 60 research papers and numerous policy events on K-12 education reform topics. He's been published numerously in most of the Boston media and a lot of newspapers, both here in 128 area, Western Mass, Essex County, and everywhere in between. Our next speaker will be Dr. Sandra Stotsky. Dr. Stotsky is an English language arts standards expert, a member of the Common Core Validation Committee, and a former senior associate commissioner in the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Donna Colorio is a Worcester City School Board member, former Worcester School Committee member, adjunct sociology and psychology faculty member at Quinsigamond Community College, and she is the founder of CommonCoreForum.org. She's also an MTA board member. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome our distinguished panel. Okay, so we're starting our discussion with what is Common Core, and our first speaker is Mr. Jamie Gass. It might be easier to speak from there. It's up to you. We're picked up. It's up to you if you want to do the podium or okay.
Yeah, because this is over here.
So thanks so much, Dean and Donna and all of you for coming out, and Lisa and all of the folks here in Foxborough for helping to set up this event. Michael Gendry and others, really grateful for all these events. We've done probably, I think, 40 or so in the last 6 to 9 months, and it's really been a great experience, I think, for people in the audience and for us panelists, too. So to begin, I'm going to just kind of give you some context about what Common Core is, because the fact is that even though 40-some-odd states have adopted Common Core, and most states did that in the summer of 2010, a lot of state legislators, a lot of parents, really have no idea what it is. So what Common Core is a set of English and math standards, national English and math standards, that were developed by the National Governors Association, which is a Washington, D.C. based trade organization that represents not states, but the governors of each state. And the Council of Chief State School Officers, which is the trade organization, Washington, D.C. based trade organization that represents the commissioners of education from each state, the state education commissioners. And it was funded largely by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You all know who Bill Gates is. He was the founder of Microsoft. He runs a $40 billion foundation. And they have bankrolled Common Core's development and advocacy to the tune of well over $200 million. Common Core will then be met with a set of national tests. For Massachusetts, that test will be the PARCC test. For a variety of other states in New England, it'll be the SBAC, or the Smart Balanced test. And so that gives you sort of the baseline of what Common Core is. But before I start, I want to begin by using a quote from someone who knew a lot more about the Constitution, about governance, about all things really American than most anybody else around. And that's James Madison. He wrote Bill of Rights, and he is considered the father of the Constitution. And he wrote this in 1792. If Congress may establish teachers in every state, county, and parish and pay them out of the public treasury, they may take into their own hands the education of children, establishing in like manner schools throughout the Union. I would venture to declare it as my opinion, it would subvert the very foundation and transmute the very nature of limited government established by the people of America. So, as I say to audiences, the Founding Fathers were very farsighted and wise. They understood that the national government can do things like defense and trade and foreign policy, but that most of the issues that most directly impact the lives of citizens are the responsibility and legal jurisdiction of the states. This arrangement, this legal arrangement, this constitutional arrangement is called federalism. And I would argue that it's taken basically this country from a loose collection of colonies along the eastern seaboard, and over the last 200 years, transitioned us into the most powerful country in the world. So it has worked. And that's particularly true in the area of K-12 education. The fact is that the Founding Fathers wanted state and local governments to be the wellspring of perpetuating our democracy, and schools were supposed to be the primary mechanism to do that. And so as successful as the country has been, somewhere around the mid to latter part of the 20th century, we began to see some erosion in the quality of public education in this country. One of the earliest examples was Sputnik in 1957, when the Soviet Union launched the first satellite into space. And it was a shot across the bow that we were sort of losing our edge against, at that time, our main competitor in the Cold War. But by 1983, there was a report called The Nation at Risk, which was authored by the Reagan administration, the Reagan U.S. Department of Education, that said that if we had the system of education that we do, imposed on us by a foreign enemy, that it would be an act of war, that we had lost dramatic ground, particularly in the area of math and science. And it was damaging our ability to compete as we were heading in towards the 21st century. But what that report did not do was come up with lots of prescriptions from Washington, D.C. on how to fix these problems, because everyone across the political spectrum, liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, have always understood what I said at the beginning, which is that K-12 education is the proper legal and financial jurisdiction of the states. What we did here in Massachusetts, and it helps give you a sense of how we got to this discussion about Common Core, is what Massachusetts did in 1993 was that Republicans and Democrats, Bill Weld and Tom Birmingham, who later became the Senate President, Mark Roosevelt, who was a state rep from Beacon Hill, again, Republicans and Democrats, sat down and they crafted the landmark 1993 Massachusetts Education Reform Act. And what was in that law was basically a deal that made for good politics and for good policy. They decided to put a great deal of state and local resources into K-12 education in exchange for all the difficult things that people in education had generally not wanted to do over the previous decades, which is returning the conversation back to the fundamentals and basics of English, mathematics, science, and history. You're fortunate because the woman who was the architect of the Massachusetts standards, which have proven to be the best standards in the country over the last 20 years, is sitting right there in the middle of the table, Sandra Stotsky. And they coupled those high-quality academic standards, which were rich in classic literature and poetry and drama, with high-quality mathematics standards, and they coupled that with the MCAS test, which is a high-stakes test that students have to pass in order to graduate from high school. The architects of this law wanted to make sure that that a high school diploma was worth the paper that it was written on. And teachers, too, were going to be held to a high level of academic expectations. And so there was teacher testing, and Dr. Stotsky was instrumental in making sure that the standards for the students and the standards for the teachers and the testing for the students and teachers were all aligned. That's sort of the golden triangle of what Massachusetts accomplished. So while the rest of the country has been sort of stuck in various degrees of stagnation and decline, Massachusetts has gone from slightly above the middle of the pack to #1 in the country and internationally competitive. There's a test called the NAEP test. It's the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's been around for approximately 40 years. No state has ever been #1 in every grade tested, in every category tested. And in 2005, Massachusetts was the first state to do that. And then we did it again in 2007, 2009, 2011, and 2013. I say that it's like It's like winning the World Series 5 times in a row and doing it in 4 games straight. Or, since we're in Foxborough, it's like the equivalent of winning lots of Super Bowls, right? But the goal of the Ed Reform Act and the goal of all this work and all this money that taxpayers and teachers and principals and superintendents have been putting into this has been international competition. That is really what that Nation at Risk report said. You got to compete with Hong Kong and Singapore and South Korea and Japan to compete in the 21st century. So in 2007 and 2013, our 4th and 8th graders performed among the tops in the world. Our 8th graders in the area of science were tied for #1 in the world. This is no small accomplishment. If doing well on national testing is the equivalent of winning the World Series, this is like winning a couple of Olympic gold medals. So that's the good news, is that in 2009, when the Obama administration initiated a thing called Race to the Top, which is a federal grant program, it's about a $4.3 billion federal grant program that they called Race to the Top, everyone in Massachusetts could rightfully say it was really the race to become Massachusetts, because nobody else could touch what we've accomplished. The bad news of all this is that in that Race to the Top grant program from the federal government is that there were incentives built in for states to adopt a set of national standards and really national tests, and that's Common Core. And so in the summer of 2010, when most people were at the beach and relaxing and having a good time and having barbecues, Massachusetts adopted the Common Core, which replaced our previously high-quality, proven, demonstrably proven K-12 education standards in English language arts and math. And so Pioneer Institute, where I work, it's a think tank. We've been around for about 20 years. We do a lot of independent research. That's what we're known for. We don't take any government money. We are known for calling it like we see it. We're known for high-quality, independent, peer-reviewed research. And so we thought that given that Massachusetts had so much to lose, that we had better take a look at the academic quality of what Common Core had to offer against high-standard states like Massachusetts and Indiana and Texas and California and Minnesota. And what our researchers found in these exhaustive 40, 50-page each drafts of Common Core against high-standard states like Massachusetts is this wasn't going to be a race to the top for Massachusetts. This was going to be a race to the middle, because both in English and in mathematics, that Common Core at every step of the way, in all the 4 drafts that they came out with leading up to their final approval, they were of significantly lower quality than what Massachusetts already had. So that was a big concern for us. Specifically, they ignored the evidence from Massachusetts and California and high standards countries, high performing countries in East Asia, and they shortened the route to Algebra 1. So under the previous academic standards in Massachusetts and California, you had access to Algebra 1 in the 8th grade. That's the gateway class, Algebra 1, for all higher level math. If you want to go on and to be a scientist or an engineer or a mathematician or really any higher level mathematics, you've got to start it early enough. You've got to have it. That's what Massachusetts did. And that was one of the secrets. Common Core neglects that. They basically say, they push Algebra 1 forward to 9th or early 10th grade. They stop algebra at what Professor Milgram, who's a professor of mathematics at Stanford University, calls Algebra 2 Light. So if you're interested in the STEM fields, your child's interested in the STEM fields, Common Core, mathematically speaking, is really a road to nowhere. Because it doesn't have the calculus and pre-calculus, calculus, trigonometry that's necessary for higher level math. In the area of English, they cut classic literature and poetry and drama that was the basis for our success in reading, historic success in reading. They cut that by about 60%. So the previous Massachusetts standards were basically 90% of Huckleberry Finn and Sherlock Holmes and Charles Dickens, all this high quality vocabulary, literature, sentences, paragraphs, all this high quality text has translated to historic gains for this state and its students. And Common Core cuts that. The next piece of research we looked at was the laws. Because as I mentioned at the beginning, everybody across the political spectrum in the K-12 world for decades has known that there are federal barriers that prohibit the federal government from encouraging or cajoling or bullying states into adopting national standards or tests. So we got the former general counsel and deputy general counsel at the U.S. Department of Education under the second Bush administration, so the two highest ranking lawyers in the federal government under the previous administration, to take a look at these laws. And they mapped out in very lawyerly, dispassionate legal analysis that there are 3 federal laws that explicitly prohibits the federal government from doing what they have done in getting states to adopt the Common Core and to push for national testing. And those laws are the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which was signed by Lyndon Johnson. There's the General Education Provisions Act of 1970, which was signed by Richard Nixon. And then there's the enabling legislation that set up the U.S. Department of Education itself, which was established in 1979 with the signature of Jimmy Carter. So 2 of the 3 presidents that signed these laws that prohibit a federal role in standards or testing were pretty liberal Democrats. So this is not really a partisan issue. It's not an ideological issue. This is a legal issue. But furthermore, as I mentioned, there are this PARCC test, which is slated to replace MCAS next year if the Board of Education approves it. And that too was directly funded by the federal government, and again, that is a direct violation of these 3 federal laws. So the final piece of research that we took a look at was that even though, had to do with cost, because even though the Gates Foundation had pumped over $200 million into Common Core's development and advocacy, even though 40-some-odd states had adopted, the reality is that few, if any, states did a cost projection about what it's going to cost the states and localities to implement the Common Core. So we enlisted a researcher who had experience both in the first Bush administration, so he worked for a Republican U.S. Department of Education, and he worked in the first administration of President Clinton, so he worked for Democrats too. And he and his team came up with a figure of about $16 billion. It's what's going to cost the states to implement Common Core. For a state like Massachusetts, so I mentioned that we've spent a lot of money over the last 20 years to become #1 in the country in internationally competitive. We've spent over $100 billion, that's billion with a B, to rise to this level. It's going to cost us an additional $350 million to implement the Common Core. That means all new textbooks, it means professional development for teachers, and the biggest cost driver is the adapting of the testing over to online testing, which is what the PARCC testing will be driven by. There's a variety of other issues around data collection. We've done research on that. I'm happy to talk a little bit about that in the Q&A. So I've given you sort of the good news and the bad news. But there is more good news. And the fact is a variety of states, frankly states that had a lot less to lose than we did, Oklahoma, South Carolina, North Carolina, Indiana, have begun the process of extracting themselves out of the Common Core. Not all of it has gone easily. There have been a lot of threats from the federal government. There's been a lot of advocacy and a lot of revolt of the clerks to undermine the efforts of those states to pull out. But states that are, in some instances, very low performing or modest performing states that had a lot less to lose than we did have gotten themselves out and are trying to figure out how they're going to move forward with new standards, how they're going to get new standards, etc. And the thing that's been interesting to me about it, and we've spoken in front of audiences of 5 people and 900 people, is that really, in most instances, it's moms and grandmothers that are driving this. And it's really a phenomenon. And I'm not saying that because we've done a lot of work on it. We've really done more of the research side of it. But the grassroots work of it has been, folks like Donna and Lisa and others that have really made this possible. They've set up forums, they've been on Facebook, they've gotten themselves educated, and they are really, really pushing the conversation. And so while I've given you a lot of information, I'm really grateful for your interest in it. I'd encourage you to keep engaged in the topic. I'd encourage you to reach out to our newly elected governor and our newly inaugurated governor, the Board of Ed, the Commissioner of Education, the legislature, and if there's things that you hear tonight that are troubling to you or of concern to you, make your voices heard. Because at least on the peeling back the PARCC involvement, that one we can win. And then if we win that, then we can begin to peel back the Common Core standards themselves. So again, I'm really grateful for your time and interest in the topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Our next speaker will be Dr. Stotsky.
Thank you. Should I just, am I picked up from here? Okay, I can just stay
Either
here.
way.
Okay, I'll stay here. I have my papers all spread out here, so easier. Okay, let me just tell you how I plan to divide my time that I will speak continuously for the next 15 to 20 minutes. First, I will tell you a little bit about the philosophy I brought to what I did at the Department of Education when I was there for almost 5 years, from 1999 to 2003. So you'll understand the standards that have been in your schools for close to 10 years, if not more, until they were knocked out after 2010 by Common Core. I will then give you some facts on Common Core in addition to what Jamie has told you. And then I will talk specifically about some flaws with the ELA and math standards in a little more detail. And then I'd like to end with some of the questions that you need to now think about with regard to the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, which is hugely important. It's taking place right now in Washington. There is an attempt to have the whole bill fast-tracked with a vote on the floor of Congress, maybe by the end of February, and it's going to affect all of these issues, but we don't know exactly how, because it will depend what changes are made to this bill, depending upon the pressure and the feedback that Senator Lamar Alexander and Representative John Klein get from the rest of the country. Let me begin first with what I tried to do in all of the areas that were under my influence or control at the Department of Education when I began in 1999, directly under Commissioner David Driscoll and in response to what the Board of Education at that time wanted. I had all the stars aligned in my heaven. They were all supporting what I was doing. First of all, I have a very strong academic background, and I wanted to focus on content knowledge. So you have had standards that have been, for the most part, weakened in both math and English, possibly in other areas, depending upon what has been going on in your schools. You have had standards that have tried to focus, for the most part, on content knowledge, which is the basis for critical thinking. You can't think in an intellectual vacuum. And the tests that went with these standards in K-12 in major subjects tried to focus on the development of content knowledge and then the critical thinking, or analytical thinking at least, that would start first. I was also concerned with trying to raise the achievement level of all students. I have been around long enough to know that we have had about a 50-year decline in the level of public education in this country in terms of reading ability by high school level. I won't go into details about readability formulas, which is something I learned how to use and understand when I was in graduate school. My work was in reading, research, reading, instruction. But we have had weakening demands on what students should read, not only in the English class for about 50 years, but also in the textbooks used in all other subjects. And there have been researchers who have looked at the level of reading difficulty in textbooks that have been able to confirm that indeed we have had a diminishing level of demand. And it is not surprising, therefore, that by the time most American students finish high school, they are still not at a level that should be there for easily reading college-level textbooks. There's a gap. But my concern was to raise everybody as much as we could through good standards and the other factors that I was also influencing in the department. I was not particularly interested in closing gaps. I was trying to raise everybody. That's a different direction. If it closes gaps, fine, but the main thing is that all groups needed to be raised. finally, I was in a position where I was also revising all the teacher licensing regulations with an incomprehensible document that I had to understand myself before I could tackle the very important issue of, if you're going to raise K-12 standards, you need teachers who are capable of teaching to those raised standards, which means you have to do something to raise the academic level of your teaching corps. I was dealing with licensure tests, with professional development criteria, anything that had an academic component, and I was coordinating all of this myself with the staff that I had there at the department. So that was what kept me busy 7 days a week for the 5 years I was there. Let me now move to the facts on Common Core. You have heard a little bit about its background. Let me also point out that I was on Common Core's validation committee, which was one of the 3 committees formed as part of this project that was sponsored by these organizations in Washington, D.C., paid for by the Gates Foundation for this purpose. Validation committee was less than 30 people. Our charge was to ensure, to the best that we could, and I won't go into the details of how we were all selected because they are basically unknown for the most part, but we were to ensure that Common Core's standards in the final version that emerged was research-based, that the standards were rigorous, and that they were internationally benchmarked. I was one of the 5 people who would not sign off on the document in May of 2010 because I didn't see that the standards met any of those 3 criteria. The one mathematician on the panel, James Milgram, whose name I will mention later on as well, we used to talk to each other a lot because we couldn't figure out what was going on, but he too did not sign off. We were basically the only 2 content people. I was the content standards expert in ELA. He was the only mathematician, which should raise a question about how is this committee supposed to function as a validation committee with one mathematician on it. Well, it's true. You don't need more than one to tell you what is in Algebra 1. I mean, he was at Stanford University and had been a mathematician there for 40 years, so he did know mathematics. But there were a group of other people called mathematics educators, which meant that they taught in schools of education, and certainly did not reach the same level of mathematical expertise that a mathematician with a PhD in mathematics has. And this is a point of confusion to this day, because you will find someone, for example, like Jeb Bush, who is running for a nomination on the Republican side of the ballot for next year's election, saying on his own Foundation for Excellence in Education that there were a lot of mathematical experts. Well, a mathematician is different from people who teach how to teach math in an ed school. But most people don't understand it, and reporters simply gloss over the distinction. If you want to know what is missing in a pre-calculus course, you do not ask someone in a math ed department in a school of ed. You ask a scientist, mathematician, or an engineer. They are the people who might know what is missing in a trigonometry or a pre-calculus course that needs to be there if you want to study calculus. Others could know too, but you would certainly go to the person whose own discipline makes them an expert in the structure and content of mathematics. So you have a validation committee that ends up, for the most part, because they don't know what it is they're approving, but 5 of us on this very small validation committee, including the only 2 content experts, saying these standards are not comparable to the best out there, our kids will not be competitive, and that there are not rigorous standards which we were led to expect we would have in Common Core. There are some other facts you should know. I don't know if you have this two-pager that's out there for you.
Well, it's
to-
one page.
Oh, it's
on
one
each side,
page
yeah.
on each side,
Yeah.
okay. I put this together last year because everyone should be aware that we have no way of knowing, because these were all private organizations, why the people were chosen to write the standards, who were chosen as standards writers, why the people who developed the first college and career readiness standards level were chosen. We can't get access to any records because there is nothing one can FOIA, go through Freedom of Information request, because it's all private organizations that did this. But after I looked at the credentials of the English Language Arts Standards writers, and Professor Milgram looked at the credentials of the people who wrote the math standards, we have both said, and we go around and testify to state legislatures, that the people who wrote our so-called national standards were unqualified to do so. They had not taught in K to 12 in English, and I'll confine these remarks now to the English part of it. They had not taught in higher ed. They had not majored in English. They were unknown to the field. To this day, no one knows why they were chosen. So you have to ask, why this total obedience to people who I have literally called charlatans? And I have used the word in print. So I don't care whether people quote me or not. I have used the word in an essay I have written, because when someone is asked at a very high level to write English standards, who doesn't have any experience teaching at any level, who has no literature major at all, who has no record of publication in the area of education or curriculum instruction, and is totally unknown to the field, you're dealing with someone who doesn't know what he is doing. He is, by the way, now president of the College Board, which just shows you, you know, no good deed goes unpunished. You know, if you do a bad job of writing English language arts standards, you get promoted to the presidency. Polish up the handle of the big front door and you become the admiral of the Navy. It's a little bit of a twist. But the point is that he has now been in charge of AP tests, aligning the SATs down to the Common Core level, which was his first task when he assumed last March, almost a year ago, the presidency of the College Board. His name is David Coleman. And David, who never would speak to me the whole time I was on validation committee, I kept asking him if he would speak to me so I could find out why he was doing what he was doing with the standards, but he was always too busy to talk to me. In any event, he has not only aligned the SATs down to the level of Common Core's high school college readiness standards, he's also changing all the AP tests, all the AP syllabi. So you have to be aware that whatever your children may be taking in high school for AP, and foreign languages is one area that has been very thoroughly gone over, but the new Advanced Placement U.S. History test has just come out with a lot of disagreement and controversy about its contents. I cannot say he was responsible for the change in the contents because it was already on its way, but he has blessed its release from the College Board. So you have a dilemma to think about. All of the indices, the college the preparation tests that our students take, the AP tests that they might take to show that they're advanced in their work, all have been touched by this effort through Common Core to reduce the academic level down by 2 to 3 grades. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. It's easier for mathematicians to see than it is for people in English to show, because you have to know the reading level of whatever the books are that English teachers are actually using in classes and what's going to be on a test. And we don't know what's going to be on your test yet. 1 more minute, okay. So if you have both flaws in English, which is one of the handouts back there, and the missing, delayed, or muddled topics in math, which is several pages long.
6 pages.
Yeah, 6 pages, and they're both on 6 different pages or 3 pages, double-sided. You will have a very succinct picture of what a math expert thinks are the problems with the math standards. Professor Milgram thinks that by grade 8, our kids are about 2 grades behind their peers in other countries. And I've given you on my page what I think are the problems with the so-called standards in Common Core. But let me finish up with ESEA, which is what I wanted to end up with. ESEA is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was first authorized in 1965 by President Johnson as part of the War on Poverty. That's where it began. It's been reauthorized several times. Its latest reauthorization was under President Bush in 2002 and was called No Child Left Behind. I'm sure you've heard of that. But it's basically a reauthorization of ESEA, which, when Congress passed it, has to be reauthorized every 7 years, but Congress doesn't get around to it, or they squabble, and this is what's happened. It's about 7 years overdue. Well, right now, Lamar Alexander, senator from Tennessee, and John Klein, representative from Minnesota, are trying to fast-track a reauthorization through, as I said, this month. And why they are doing that, this is, again, my hypothesis, because they are saying they want to restore some of the autonomy to states and local school boards that No Child Left Behind and Common Core have taken away. But if you read through drafts, which are available if you go to the web and Google their names, you can find out what the drafts look like, you will see that actually they're doing very little to restore or empower parents, as they put it. They are making some of Title I money portable, which means that parents may be able to qualify in states that get the money to send their kids with, like, vouchers to schools of their own choice. But the problem is that this is a way to establish a beachhead in a private school with the tentacles from the testing regime that is mandated by ESEA, because it continues the same option of testing at every grade level, from K to 8, and then once at the high school level, that No Child Left Behind started and Common Core intensified. ESEA, in my opinion, and I just finished writing a short op-ed on this, has become a means for imposing testing mandates that seem to benefit no one except researchers and test companies, and for increasing federal control of education, which is what a main goal is, how to centralize educational decision-making. That leaves parents like you in all towns and cities not getting any satisfaction from your teachers and superintendents or local school boards, because the local school boards have practically lost all power whatsoever with this particular version of ESEA. It is so detailed that it has a section on what local report cards should look like. When I looked at that, I said, how does this empower parents? Obviously, it can't. It is designed to take away power, but in a very Orwellian way, what it is doing is saying it's going to empower parents as it takes away the power. So I think we should have more questions about ESEA and what people out there in communities like yours could be doing to get your voice raised about how this bill should be reauthorized, if it should be, given that there's been no public deliberation whatsoever about it. And if you want to know something about me, I'm an old town meeting member person, and I think we need to have some public discussion of what is going on with ESEA.
Here we are. And here we are.
Here we
And
are.
here's where we start.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you very much. Okay, so before we move on, John, give me 30 seconds. Our first two speakers have given you a very good and thorough overview of not only what's been going on at the state level since 1993, with the Ed Reform Act that Jamie spoke about, but also at the federal level with what Sandy talked about with ESEA, otherwise known now as No Child Left Behind, which has opened up the avenue for mandatory high-stakes testing in our schools, as Sandy noted, K through 12, and then once at the high school. So that leads me to my next point about us teachers being impacted by these federal and state laws, trying to navigate through our courses of study, through the curriculum, and how that translates down to your children. As an educator, I am on the receiving end of all of what Jamie and Sandy have talked about, which leads us to our final panelist, Donna Calorio, who founded CommonCoreForum.org to navigate through the changes, the drastic changes that have taken place, as noted by our two original speakers. Donna Calorio.
Thank you, Dean. Well, let me just give you a quick background. As a parent of 3, I have to confess something. Up until Common Core, I was in the dark about education standards. I went to work every day, I trusted the teachers, you know, I put my trust in the school boards, I put my trust in the state, I just went along my way. Mind you, I'm an educator as an adjunct professor at the local college, but I would see some deterioration, and it would just be, I just questioned it here and there, but I didn't really take a vested interest in the process. In 2011, I decided to run for the Worcester School Committee. And pre-election, we had our first set of debates. We have like 5 debates. It's like, you know, the presidential debates in Worcester for a school board. And one of the first questions they asked us about was, what was your feeling about Common Core? What did you think about Common Core? Knowing nothing about Common Core, I ran home, I Googled it, I wanted to be prepared for my first debate. And it said, you know, federal takeover of education, you know, loss of parental control. So I had basic outline of what it was. I went back to my first debate and I said, I'm against it. I have never regretted that statement, trust me. So I did get elected. I won by 2 votes, believe it or not, out of 8,000 votes. And on I was to serve my first term in the Worcester School Committee. And as we progressed, the first thing we deal with is the budget. And as a school board member, budget's very important. Worcester, actually, our budget was increasing. Our budget was increasing, but our discretionary monies was getting less and less. So as we increased the money, we didn't have enough money to spend on the front lines for teachers, instructional aides, the people that really were in the front lines of education. That puzzled me. And I'm thinking, why? Where's all that money going to? Well, it was getting eaten up by mandates, unfunded mandates. One of them being Common Core. So I had to dig into my budget because it wasn't as clear as it is now, because you can really see it in budget line items now, but it was starting to it was really murky. So we started to dig into all these different budget items and seeing where the money was going for. So I spent a lot of time looking into Common Core. In around May of, in March of 2013, I had spoke to a colleague of mine and I said, do you know anybody that would be an expert in Common Core? Because I'm really getting mixed messages. I don't know who to believe, what to believe. You know, you're reading all this documentation, you're hearing certain, you know, lines from your superintendent, your other school committee members going, don't bring up Common Core, don't bring it up, Donna, just let it lie. We voted on it, it's a done deal, just keep going, you know, don't even bring it up. So the woman that was running the Worcester Research Bureau at the time, Roberta Schaefer, said, I know one expert, Sandy Stotsky. I said, oh, okay, where does she live? She lives right here in Massachusetts. Well, that began the beginning of where we are today. We had our first forum in Worcester in May of 2013, and at that point I said, nobody is going to show up, nobody. And we had standing room only, 125 people in our library. We brought a lot of interest, and we started the conversation moving in the right direction. Well, as it progressed, we had noticed that I had seen a lot of little satellite groups. This group here, or maybe it was one parent in Mansfield, another parent here, a teacher in Boston, all struggling with the same things, either as a teacher, as a parent, as a school committee. No one really knew where to go for information. So in in March of 2014, not even a year ago, we put together what we now have as Common Core Forum, which is a nonpartisan, all volunteer group of people that go out to educate the public, to work with our legislators, to work in the community, to educate people on Common Core. And the things that and I'm just going to go just briefly, Dean, because I know there's a lot of questions and we want to get right to the Q&A. One of the things that we've worked on, and Jamie had mentioned, is these forums. And we have had these forums, probably about 40 throughout the year, throughout the state, to educate parents and bring to you, I believe, two of the best people in Massachusetts, Jamie and Sandra. I mean, they are experts in their field. People travel from all over the country to hear them speak, and this is an honor to have them here with you. And I know that because we were in Maine doing a conference back in, I think, November or October, and people had traveled hours upon hours just to hear them speak. So Common Core Forum is working to support legislation that is going to eliminate Common Core in the state of Massachusetts and eliminate PARCC, the PARCC testing. We also are working with local communities in non-binding questions that they are going to put on their ballots. And we're also working and supporting various school committee members, parents that are running for the first time for their school boards, to take an active interest and try to help navigate through this process. One thing we did notice last June when we were out there lobbying for communities to vote for the MCAS, to stay with the MCAS as opposed to going to the PARCC, is that we noticed that more than half of the school committee members that we contacted, probably more, I'd say more towards like 75%, had no clue what Common Core was. These are your school committee members. Now, I'm not talking about Foxborough because I'd have to look back on my notes and see if we did have a communication with someone from Foxborough. But we had a lot of school committee members that did not understand, A, their role as school committee member, that they had the right and the responsibility to navigate their school and their curriculum. It wasn't the superintendent that would tell them what to do. It was their job to tell the superintendent what to do. And we had a lot of miscommunication, but we did spend a lot of time educating school committee members. So we have worked with the school committee members. The other thing that we're working on is we will be working at the State House on April 15th to lobby our state reps and our senators. We're going to have a lobby day, so we invite all parents from all communities to come up, help us out, and we're going to spend the whole morning going to the different state reps and legislators to educate them on Common Core, because as we found out also, our state reps and the state senators don't know anything. They're getting their talking points from the Department of Ed. And if you want to see what the talking points include, it's basically, it's a done deal. Move on. When in fact, there's a lot of room to get rid of this PARCC testing. And I'm just trying to think if there's anything else that we're doing. Well, we're doing these forums, obviously. We have another one coming up in Drake and in North Reading. But all to say is that one of the questions that I kept hearing as we do these forums is that our school committee is not doing Common Core. You're wrong. I had a teacher in Spencer say to me last summer, "We are absolutely not doing Common Core." And I'm like, "You're doing Common Core." "No, we are not doing Common Core." She's like, I said, "You're doing Common Core. It's disguised." And there's so many ways that it was disguised that it just slid in. There was these new programs. Who knew these new math programs? It was Common Core. The new books. I'm like, read the bottom of your book. Does it say Common Core in your book? Yeah. Well, you're doing Common Core, you know. So these are a lot of areas that we've had to spend time even with the teachers. I have spoke at the MTA convention. I've spoke at the Worcester delegates meeting to educate even teachers to what to look for. So we're gonna, I guess Dean's gonna open up in a couple minutes to questions, and we really look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to invite your questions. Looking at Donna's notes over there, it's interesting to hear her talk about how the word is finally getting out, that this is not just a partisan issue, that this is not just an issue isolated for a few activists or legislators, that many people on both sides of the aisle are stepping forward to support the legislation that we'll be pushing at the State House this current session. Looking at her list of co-sponsors, I see Democrats and Republicans that are finally stepping up saying, wait a minute, it's time to put the brakes on a lot of this to kind of get a sense of what we've been doing because of such the lack of a public information process that Sandy talked about. The fact that so many of these changes have been done, not in the light of day, but behind closed doors and without a lot of media attention. So with that, I have a couple of questions that have been handed to me. I invite you to raise your hand. We'll repeat the question up here just for the purposes of our audio visual, and we'll have our panelists answer it. One of the ones that I like to always open up with, Jamie, if we did this the other night in Beverly, was the following question. And it kind of makes the point that we talked about earlier. Jamie, did the Massachusetts legislature vote to adopt Common Core and the changes outlined by our speakers tonight?
So the short answer is no. There were no bills, there were no hearings, there was no public deliberation in the legislature whatsoever about the adoption of Common Core or any kind of migrating away from the previous standards or MCAS, even though the expectations of the previous standards and MCAS are articulated in the education reform law. And so, you know, it really has been kind of a remarkable thing. I mean, one of the key architects of the ed reform law in 1993 is a guy named Tom Birmingham. He had a great relationship with organized labor. He had been Senate president. And he and Bill Weld, who was the Republican governor in 93, who signed the ed reform law, both of them in 2010 when Massachusetts adopted, and just a year or so ago when the state was celebrating the anniversary of the ed reform law, both said that they thought it was an enormous mistake for the state to adopt Common Core and in just insanity to move away from the MCAS, given the proven quality of the standards and the proven performance. I mean, that's the thing I think is kind of telling is that most of the organizations from Washington, D.C. that are driving this are private organizations, and so circumventing a public deliberative process has really been their strategy from day one. I mean, Dr. Stotsky talked about how if you wanted to have a Freedom of Information Act search, which all public officials are subject to, related to Common Core or to the PARCC testing, these are being driven by private entities. You can't get that basic information. And I think the thing that's startling to me as both a citizen and a parent is that if the people that are driving the process are supposed to be publicly accountable and they're supposed to be instructing our young people about civics and about the way you do things in a democracy, and they're putting themselves outside the law and they're not subject to public scrutiny, in fact, 9 times out of 10 will not even engage in an event like this. You invite Donna over and over again, has invited people from the State Department of Education. They won't debate this topic. Many superintendents won't debate it. And it's not just in Massachusetts, in lots of places. And I just think it sends in a horrendous anti-civics lesson because at an absolute minimum, because taxpayers in the states and localities are paying for all of this, they should be subject to the scrutiny that a public deliberative process in the legislature or public forums, should hold them to account to.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am.
Just follow up on what you were saying. If the legislature
Yes.
was not the authority that voted to accept Common Core,
Yep.
then who or what
The
did make that decision, and how was that?
The decision, and Sandy can talk about it in more detail, was the State Board of Education. It is true that standards approval is the jurisdiction of the State Board of Education. But I think the thing that's telling about it, and again, Sandy was on the board when they were doing this, is that there were 3 evaluations that the Commissioner of Education was relying upon for his judgment about whether to adopt Common Core or not. There was the Mass Business Alliance for Education, there was the Fordham Institute, which is in Washington, D.C., and Achieve Inc., who was in Washington, D.C. Later, by the way, Achieve Inc. got the PARCC test. They're the ones who run the PARCC test. So what's the common thing about these three entities is that all of them accepted money from the Gates Foundation to do their evaluations. And so these are organizations that accepted money by the people that are developing the standards. I mean, this is a kind of basic violation of not being judge and jury in your own case. But Sandy can talk to you a lot more detail because she's on the board about the enormous number of peculiarities and oddities about this whole thing, not the least of which in Channel 5 in 2010 did a whole story about prior to Massachusetts adopting, the State Commissioner of Education and his senior staff level folks were taking all expense paid trips all around the country to advocate for Common Core in other states. I mean, there's an enormous number of conflicts of interest here that really, I think, corrupted, frankly, the whole adoption process in the state.
Could I just answer your question also by saying that it's true in most states that the State Board of Education has the statutory authority to adopt standards and tests. Now, in many states, no local school districts need to adopt the same standards that the state board has adopted. New Hampshire has it very clear in its own statute. But under local control, the local school districts can actually adopt or use any set of standards they want. It's that under statute, the state board has the authority to impose a state test of its choice on the state, and therefore school districts must administer that test. And that's where all of the local school districts get caught up, because if they have used a different set of different set of standards, have developed curriculum for these standards, they're still going to be tested by a test that was developed on the basis of other standards.
Okay, I want to interject here with one
It's
thing
a
because
legal
it
issue.
came from the audience here, and I'll let Sandy comment on it, and Donna, you could jump in. So along the lines of what you just said, what makes the MCAS as originally conceived superior to the PARCC pilot?
Okay, that's a very good question. The MCAS was based, first of all, on the standards that were developed when I was there, or revised when I was there, the K-12 standards, and they were all first-class standards, so it was very clear what they were being based on, the MCAS tests. They were being based on good standards. Second, they were being developed as test items by teachers in the state. This is not the case with the Smarter Balance or the PARCC test, which are both being developed elsewhere by other groups of people. We don't even know necessarily who. Third, the MCAS was better in that the teachers who were on these assessment development committees, and I had helped to appoint some of them there, had very high standards and were known throughout the state, so that other teachers knew that their peers in the state were helping to shape these test items. This created a certain amount of confidence in what these test items would be, because it was the teachers that they could call up, speak to, or find out about. And that made for a huge amount of at least feeling that they were involved through their peers, if not directly, in shaping these test items. Fourth, and this was part of the statute that was part of the Massachusetts Ed Reform Act, all items have to be released with MCAS. So after MCAS was given, within a year, parents, kids, others could see what the test items were. You can't do that with PARCC. First of all, it's all computer-based, and teachers can't see the items ahead of time, so far as I know. Kids can't ever see them afterwards. Teachers won't be able to see them afterwards. Parents won't be able to see them at all. In some cases, teachers may have been asked to take a preliminary version. This was true in Nashua, New Hampshire. but I don't think this has happened here in Massachusetts. I wouldn't know because it could be a different arrangement in different towns and communities. But once items are released, you understand what your child is being graded on, and it makes a huge difference for the grade 11 test, PARCC, which will be college readiness. That's the test that's going to determine eventually whether your child is declared college ready or not, which means if they're college ready, they take credit-bearing courses as freshmen if they apply to and get into a college in the state. This is the link. That's why they're called college readiness standards. But this was the prize they were aiming for. So MCAS didn't have that. MCAS was a set of standards for tests that would determine high school diploma competency. Huge
Okay,
difference.
We'll go Donna real quick, then Jamie.
Okay, I just want to, I'll simplify it. It was the Commissioner of Education, Commissioner Chester, and the Governor, Governor Deval Patrick. Those are the two signatures to adopt the Common Core. Now, if the next question is how do we get rid of the Common Core, because I'm sure that's what I'm hearing you say, so we would have to, let's just back it up. We'd have to have the Commissioner of Education, Commissioner Chester still, who is also on the board of PARCC,
He's
say-
chair of the board.
Chair of the board. So you'd have to have him say, we don't want this anymore. We'd have to have Governor, now new Governor Baker, have an executive order, or you have the legislators adopt or vote on a bill to get rid of it. And we have 7 pieces of legislation that have been submitted in the last month. So there are 3 avenues that I can see, unless I'm overlooking something, maybe something on the federal level, which I know there's some federal bills that are been
Well,
proposed.
ESEA may totally wipe out all of this. If it passes and Congress votes for it, it's then Congress voting that says, under
We have
current
no-
wording, we don't know what the wording is going to be yet, but if the current wording goes through, it says that state departments of education may submit a plan, set of academic standards for approval by the Secretary of Education. Well,
So then we won't have any control.
You won't have any say at all.
So that's kind of like on the side. If you look at what's happening now, that was the avenue, and now these are the 3 ways that we can get rid of PARCC/Common Core in the state, as it is now.
Right now.
Unless something comes off on the federal level, and then we are in a different dilemma, right?
Yeah, so, the big difference between MCAS and PARCC, without even getting into the specifics of it, is that MCAS was owned and run by Massachusetts, right? All right. We had a contract with a company called Measured Progress up in New Hampshire. If there was any problems with that contract, state officials could amend it, revise it, etc. With PARCC, we're in a consortium now. They started off with 25 states, I think it was, in PARCC. They're now down to 12, which tells you the level of confidence that even member states have in it, okay? But any decisions that have been made about PARCC, it's not just Massachusetts anymore. It's Massachusetts in conjunction with Arkansas, New Mexico. I mean, you're talking about states that are really low performing, really low performing. So people say, oh, well, Massachusetts has a seat at the table under PARCC. Yeah, we had a seat at the table. We used to own the table under MCAS. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that MCAS has correlated, as I mentioned earlier, with historic gains on almost every measure of educational performance, whether national or international, right? And they were based on higher quality standards, okay? The thing that's also troubling about this is that, again, the MCAS was accountable to state officials. It's not accountable to really anybody in Massachusetts, not the governor, not the Board of Ed, not
You
the
mean
commission.
PARCC.
PARCC isn't. PARCC is not, okay? And the thing that's really telling about PARCC is that the people that are developing it is Achieving. In 20 some odd years of being around, Achieving has never done student assessments or student tests before. Oh, and the other thing is that like all the other people around Common Core, they've never improved student achievement anywhere in the last 20 years. Not one place. Not one city, town, school, state, etc. So, when Sandy talks about this as being driven by people who are charlatans, it's not a wild, accusation, because the fact is that these people don't have good records, and now they've got, 20 million school children that are kind of being corralled into this.
And it's all buried in computers. The point is that there's no way to find out what these test items look like.
Next question, Patrick.
I have one or two.
Give us
First
your
off,
best one.
quickly, would it be best to let ESEA sunset?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Would it be best to let ESEA sunset?
Oh, ESEA, I'm
Expire,
sorry.
you mean?
Yeah.
Yes, it actually would be better to get rid of it because it has morphed from 1965 to a set of testing mandates and something that was never in the original ESEA authorization. It didn't require any testing in 1965. Every time, and this is probably the thing that people have to start understanding, what has been driving ESEA? You may not understand it, but it's going to govern all of public education. It was supposed to be only a way to help low-income children. That was its goal. That was why it was a part of the war on poverty. It was designed to provide Title I money to states that applied for it that would improve the education of low-income children. Well, testing got into it, and it was then developed full force under No Child Left Behind. That's when you really had the blossoming of a real big testing framework, 3 through 8 plus high school. Common Core raced to the top, added a few more grades, K1, 2 through 8, and then also high school, but now the college readiness piece ties to high school. So it's like the camel's nose gets under the tent, and then within a little while you've got the entire camel under the tent, and you've got to figure out what do you do with something that's morphed totally from what might have been benign back in 1965 to an act that is now taking control not just of the education of low-income children, all children, not even in just the public schools, but through vouchers into Catholic schools, private schools. Homeschoolers are worried about the high school piece. They're not affected during the years of K to high school, but once their kids get to high school and want to go to college, even homeschoolers have to worry about it. So it affects everybody. And what is it basically consisting of? A series of tests. Now, I just want to add this piece because this is now fresh. I've been arguing all day with several people about the testing regime. And I've been saying, why should we want annual testing? Because there's now a push to promote annual testing as beneficial to low-income kids. And my question is, where do we have any evidence that having annual tests in all major subjects, year after year after year, has benefited anybody, never mind low-income kids? Do we have any intuitive feeling as well as evidence that it could possibly help? How can state and federal test scores improve what a kid is learning in class? You'd have to think for yourself, because it's like we've got lemmings going over a cliff. They can't think of anything except testing. If you want accountability, and that's the big concept we haven't mentioned, all of this has been driven by the notion that if you're going to give money to school communities, state or federal government, you've got to have accountability. Sounds good. That if you give anybody money, you want to have them accountable for, in some way, for whatever they do with that money. So how do you develop accountability for Title I money if you don't test kids? It seems like the bureaucratic imagination is totally impoverished. It can't think of anything else except tests, tests, and more tests. Think of it.
Next question from the gentleman.
Let's have more questions.
So it's my understanding that in the state of Massachusetts, we began to change our curriculum frameworks to Common Core 2010.
Yes, they began in
I'm just wondering,
11, yeah.
Is that long enough that you'd expect to begin to see the effects of lower standards, such as on NEET or colleges reporting students who need more remediation?
Jamie knows.
So the early
You
piece of
could
evidence,
start.
and again, it's hard to say that there's a direct line of causality, but we were on a pretty good trajectory where we were, leading the country. It's true that we're number one, but we weren't improving, right? But what we do know is that the 4th grade reading test on NAEP, the National Report Card, as any third or fourth grade reading test is a very strong predictor of future academic achievement. And what we know now, we adopted in 2010, we have the 2013 NAEP scores, and between 2011 and 2015 on fourth grade reading on NAEP, guess what state was the biggest drop in the country? We're still number one, Massachusetts, right? So the only thing that changed during that 2-year period of time was the adoption of Common Core, which, the evidence and the research that we put together makes pretty clear is poor quality. So that is the only piece of evidence. But a lot of what they're trying to do, Sandy talked a little bit about aligning the SAT or the AP. They're trying to remove these external measures to prove that it's having a bad impact.
Any independent source of information has been changed. SATs, GEDs have been aligned to Common Core. ACT has been aligned to Common Core. And if PISA, which is one of the international test programs for international student assessment, is used, which the Department of Ed wants, it only tests skills at the age of 15 for kids. It's a one-time test. And it only tests skills with very low content. Mathematicians who have looked at the content level of the math portion have said it's at about at the 5th grade level in terms of math content, because it's testing skills. So that doesn't tell you anything. TIMS is so far the only TIMSS, third Trends in International Mathematics and Science Survey. We have taken it as a separate country in 2007 and in 2013, and that was when we tied for first place in science, grade 8. That was how we knew we had good science standards, which are now being jumped for next generation science standards. I don't understand how people can just get rid of school boards, administrators, science departments. This is something I keep asking everyone, a few people here too. What reasons are they giving? Because there are some reviews by scientists who said it basically shortens high school chemistry, almost makes it disappear, and it makes physics unteachable at the high school level. This is not Massachusetts. But these are what your state boards across the country, local school boards or committees are adopting. And we don't understand it, because if they asked people in higher ed, there's no shortage of them in this state, to look at these documents and give their professional opinions about the quality of these standards at the high school level, at least that they can see is closer to the college level, they could tell you that there are some things missing from these standards that are being adopted by local school boards who typically don't contain, across the country, people who know how to read high school math and science standards. That I know because I've asked huge audiences of people wherever I've spoken, how many of you can read a set of math standards? One hand will go up in 150 people. He's a math prof at a local community college. Nobody else can read, but they're the ones voting on it. Would we do that if we were going for surgery and we wanted a second or third opinion, buying a car? Would you not want to at least look up some information about the quality of the car? I don't really understand the phenomenon. It's happening here in Foxborough because you've adopted and you're implementing Common Core. It's happening in all the communities around here. Massachusetts has one of the highest rates of education. Where are the revolts taking place here?
Okay, so now I'm going to move to some more questions, but also I want to give our panel an oral testing question. I'm going to ask each of them to answer with 1 or 2 bullet points, and I'm going to go from Donna, then to Sandy, then to Jamie. The following question. In light of our discussion, in light of the tremendous flux that's going on in education reform, which is probably the only thing we've solved tonight, the only thing comparable might be healthcare and the Affordable Care Act, so-called, and what is uncertain in that realm going forward. So panel, how can parents, teachers, audience members, local officials bring back, quote-unquote, local control? Donna.
Me first, wow. I think you have to educate. That's number one, which we're doing here, and become involved, which I wasn't when my kids were young. Now that I understand what's out there and what we can do, but I believe that in numbers we can successfully defeat Common Core in the state of Massachusetts. I truly believe that. And we can restore local control. So I would say get active with Common Core Forum. We have an organizational meeting coming up next Monday, right, Patrick? Right here.
Omni restaurant.
Right here in the town. So we can talk to Patrick afterwards.
next time.
But, yeah, we're actually right here in the town, right?
Franklin, Mass.
No, Franklin. Oh, close enough.
Alumni
We can't, yeah, it's close enough. I mean, we're down 495, that's all I care about. So I would say that would be the way that we can restore, is we need to revolt. We need to say, we can't do this anymore. Absolutely, you know, I draw the line. This is my child. The federal government is not going to educate my child. Some DC organization is not going to educate my child. I have the right to educate my child. Sandy.
Okay. First thing I tell parents is that you have the right to opt out anywhere. And the more parents that opt out, just say they're not letting their children take the test. They don't have to have permission from anybody. Parents have rights that go back 400 years in this country, whether you're a state or a territory, colony or a territory. You can keep your child home from school if they're sick. You can keep your child home from school if you don't want them to go on a field trip. Because if there's less than 95% participation at a grade level, the test scores are invalid. That's to aim for. It's a possibility. So you can opt out. You can engage in, call it civil disobedience. It's another honorable term in this state. It used to be an essay that was well read in grade 11, still may be. Parents can put new life into the term. So that's another thing. Civil, simply just say that you're not going to do whatever Common Core asks you to do. Third, you can contact Senator Alexander and Representative Klein. Google their names. They have ways of sending emails to them.
Sandy, I would note that Senator Alexander was a former Secretary of Education before
Yeah,
he was
under
an elected
Reagan.
official. Yeah.
Yeah,
Bush.
yeah,
Yeah, he's elected.
earlier, I think.
It was under Bush, it wasn't.
It was under Bush, not Reagan.
Right.
Okay. Sorry, thank you. In any event, they have email addresses that you can use to send something to them from out of state. I mean, all of these people have to have some way of having the public communicate with them. And just let them know that you really want true parent empowerment, not make-believe parent empowerment, and that you want to be able to at least design the report card that your child gets in the public schools. I find that one so incredible, it's mind-blowing. I mean, that is exactly where accountability rests.
Okay,
The
Jamie,
report
how do we
card.
bring back local control and move beyond tonight's meeting?
So these ladies have given you lots of good suggestions. I would encourage you to stay active in Donna's organization. I think that she has done an enormous public service in the last 6 or 9 months. She's done other great public service, but in the last 6 or 9 months, she's really helped drive the conversation in the state in a way that it didn't happen before. I mean, Pioneer Institute, where I work, we've done tons of op-eds. We've worked with all the editorial boards across the state since 2010. They run lots of the op-eds. Most of the editorial boards across Massachusetts have done lots and lots of in-house editorials against Common Core. But Donna really, and the folks that she's worked with to really help drive the conversation by getting parents and moms motivated and educated on this, I think has done an enormous service. But I think that on the short term, the best thing you can do, we have a new governor, and Governor Baker was opposed to adopting Common Core in 2010. He was, I think, maybe one of the only people that testified in front of the Board of Education in 2010 against adopting. This time around when he ran, he was a little bit ambiguous about that. But he's on the record as being opposed to it. And I think that, you see these signs here behind us around PARCC and not adopting PARCC. The Board of Ed has not formally adopted PARCC yet. They'll do that in the fall. But the more people that reach out to him and his office and his Secretary of Education, his name is Jim Pizer, reach out to him and make their opinions known to him, the better. Because if we don't have PARCC, then that does not lock us into Common Core the way it would if we did have PARCC. That gives us, the state, a lot more independence and a lot more flexibility to then open up a whole other conversation about how we return to the higher proven standards. But and it's not just exclusively to the governor. I mean, it's the legislative leadership and your legislators and on both the federal level and the state level. But I think the most immediate one is really making the governor and his officials aware of the growing displeasure about it. I think that's probably the best thing in the most short term.
They're hearing from
Yep.
others. You
Yep.
see, that's the problem. There are other pressure groups that want the status quo and Common Core. So Secretary of Education Jim Pizer and Governor Baker have simply got to know that parents have other views, or that there are a lot of parents with
And
other
some of the
views.
other groups, mind you, have spoken in public stating that they receive Gates money. Of course you would want Common Core. One thing about our group, do we accept any Gates money? No, we don't. But the thing is, we have a lot of this on if you're not, you haven't liked our Facebook page, Common Core Forum, or you're not on you haven't on our website, commoncoreforum.org, you can actually just submit a request and we'll put you on the email list. So if we are going to petition the legislation, or we're going to petition Governor Baker or Secretary Pizer, we'll send out an email and we'll explain how you do it, so you're not in the dark. So, and we'll give you what we need, what you need to do, what the emails are, et cetera, et cetera. So we're very active in helping parents navigate. Now, mind you can do it on your own, that's fine, but one of the things you have to realize is that if they are hearing, we testified, just back up, to the Board of Ed last May, I believe, in one of the bills. We had 50 parents there. 20 of us spoke, 3 minutes. Shannon spoke, I spoke. We testified against we wanted accountability with the park. We wanted them to run a cost analysis. 2 or 3 of the big players got up there, and that was it. We were null and void. So we need to get our voices heard. We have to continually pressure the Department of Ed. We have to, the Joint Education Committee, the governor, Pizer. We have to keep putting the pressure on them all, because they have to know there's not just me, Donna. It's not an imaginary group. It's other parents that are concerned. And, you know.
And depending on what the Congress does with ESEA or No Child Left Behind, it might be back in their lap anyway. So the idea that this is somehow going to go away is just completely a fantasy.
These next 9 months are going to make or break us, period. That's it.
It could really impact the next decade.
Yeah, it could. So, I mean, if you're thinking this is, I don't know if I have the time and the commitment, 9 months. That's it. 9 months and it's going to be over. Good, bad, or we're going to be on our way to a more positive, which I believe we will. But we have to keep the pressure up now.
Question up front.
Just as a parent, the frustration, my children go to a private Catholic school in Worcester. We thought, was that coming to our school?
Oh,
You
yeah.
know?
Okay.
And here it is, right?
Mhm.
We're paying a technology fee associated with Common Core now, on top of our tuition and everything else we pay for. Very frustrating. And the more parents I talk to, engage with, they're frustrated with the day-to-day homework, that problem didn't make any sense, where is this coming from? It's Common Core, it's Common Core. And then it's just, they lose interest completely. So you feel like you're alone in this school with people that are educated, but yet they don't seem to care.
There is a Catholic group, but I can't tell you the name. Dan Guernsey was working with it, and a Father Stravinskas in New Jersey. If you Google their names, you may find, and it's connected to the Cardinal Newman societies at the college level, but there's a whole group of them who are trying, including a professor of law at Notre Dame University.
Well, I have to say, I totally identify, because my daughter spent 1 year, I won't mention the school, and she was in high school, she didn't bring her book home. I didn't know it till like considerable amount. I remember I'm out here talking about Common Core, and she brings her my math book, and I go, "You have Common Core math?" And this was Catholic school. So I marched my way up there, and they go, whatever. I said, and then we left, because I said, I'm getting this, we're going to get the same math in the public school. We're all Common Core now, right? But the interesting thing is, what you're going to hear is, you know what? This is what ed reform was about. We had a couple growing pains. Just a different program. No, it is not. Way different, as you hear. So you have to educate these parents and let them understand that we, like Jamie said, the analogy, we own the table with our standards. We have a standard expert here that actually helped write these standards in Massachusetts. Do we have a standard expert here that wrote the Common Core? No, we couldn't even find the person that wrote the Common Core because there's no accountability. So when you're talking about these outside programs, this is a federal program. This is not our program. This is not our state, our community. We can't change. My daughter has had crazy books to read, crazy books, as a junior in high school. Crazy books that have nothing to do with English in her English course. And I say, well, why do we have these books? Common Core approved. Well, can we change them? No, it's Common Core approved. Before, 5 years ago, you go up and you make a lot of noise and your school would get all nervous and they're like, oh, let's change that book. The parents don't like it because we were locally vested in our education. Now it's charts that say Common Core. It's books that say Common Core. Everything, and a teacher can just say, well, it's Common Core approved. They can't do anything.
The thing that's particularly disturbing about the Catholic schools adopting is that they were not under any federal mandate and whatsoever to adopt. And I remember when they did, because we were, at that time, Pioneer Institute where I work, we were doing a big paper on the performance of the Archdiocese schools. And if you separate the Catholic schools out, it's actually the largest school district in the state. It's larger than Boston. And what's remarkable about it is that they had adopted the previous Massachusetts standards, the standards that Sandy had developed, and that it correlated with these other these remarkable gains. And as well as the state has done, with a very similar demographic composition, the Archdiocese schools, on the couple of measures that we had, which is the SAT and the Stanford 9, I think it is, they were outperforming Massachusetts. So it's another piece of evidence that we know, as if we didn't have enough from the performance of the standards that Sandy had worked on, that they correlated with big gains. But the Archdiocese, they were doing even better. And again, they weren't compelled to, except for the problem, the issue that Catholic schooling is having in this country is that it's having an enormous drop in decline in its enrollments. And so when the Gates Foundation comes knocking with grant money, there's a kind of quiet quid pro quo that goes on, and that's why they adopt. And I think I would go a step further. The thing that's really troubling about it is that it's not only not good for the students, it's not good for Catholic schooling, because the thing that makes them unique is that they're not the public schools, and that they can teach religious instruction and spiritual instruction. And it seems like it's a kind of a fine point, but when I was talking earlier about the loss of literature, there's a book that came out a couple of years ago called The Storytelling Animal. Human beings are the storytelling animal, right? Whether you're a lawyer telling a story or making a case in a court of law, or whether it's a politician talking about their narrative, or whether you're reading scripture or Aesop's fables or what have you, the thing that kind of makes us human is our storytelling interest, right? Well, Common Core has decided to ignore that. And it's particularly damaging, I think, to Catholic education, because storytelling and parables and the kind of moral instruction that you find in something like Huckleberry Finn, where Huck and Jim are talking about friendship and all of these things that bind us together and make us human. Any school can do this, but religious schools can go a step further because they can talk about character education, moral development, spiritual development in ways that public schools oftentimes either can't or don't. And so it is tragic. The good news of it is that in lots of states, the people that had pushed the hardest against Common Core, and I'll use the example of Indiana, it was two Catholic school moms. They were basically able to defeat a candidate for statewide commissioner or state superintendent, who had $3 million in backing. He was a heavy favorite, and they were able to defeat him because their students were having to take the Common Core, because in Indiana they have a school choice voucher program where the Catholic schools have to adopt the state test and the state standard, which in that instance was Common Core, and that's how they got animated on all this. So don't lose heart. I mean, there are other Catholic school moms out there. There are schools. I think Sandy sits on the board of a Catholic school in Natick that popped up
It's
because
an
a bunch of moms.
independent one
Yep, and
that is anti-Common Core.
a bunch
Hard
of
to get in.
but bunch of moms.
Hard to get in.
I went with them to the Archdiocese. They tried to make their case to the Archdiocese. The Archdiocese wouldn't even let me participate.
But you know, practically speaking, though, I think for the basis of the next 9 months, I think if what I'm hearing from the panel, we have to hone our advocacy, right? We're dealing with maybe 10 or 15 opinion leaders, elected leaders that are going to drive the agenda. Lamar Alexander, the chairman of the Senate Education Committee, is going to have enormous influence over what bill gets voted out at the U.S. Senate level. Our joint education committee will vote on all of the bills that Donna and Common Core Forum has advocated for to slow things down. Those are 2 members of a 200-member state legislature. Your own elected officials here at any level, if they hear enough pushback, enough complaints, enough questions about why this process was rolled out the way it was, they will ask the questions and in turn slow it down even further. And then whatever version of the federal law that gets voted out could have a dramatic domino effect over where Massachusetts goes with the next generation of ed reform, and then it's back to the local level, whether people like it or not.
And Dean, let me add one thing on the local level. One thing you don't realize is not the diocesan schools, but the independent Catholic schools. There's usually a board that is elected, like St. John's has a board, Notre Dame has a board, Venerini has a board in Worcester. If you have to find out who these board members are, and guess what, guys? You got to get on the boards. You got to get on the boards because for the future reference, we don't know what's going to come down the pike, but future reference, I've met independent board members and some of these Catholic schools I just mentioned did not know what Common Core was. And I said, do you realize you have Common Core in your school? And they said, no, we don't. And I had to educate board members that voted on it. So you need to be on your boards. If you have an independent Catholic school, you would need to be on anything you can get in the church boards. Get on a church board so then you can align with some of the priests. Some of the priests are so against Common Core. And you need to align with them because they're not hearing that parents are objecting to this.
We have a question in the back.
Okay.
Can you speak a little bit about data mining on all the students, please?
Sure. So we did a paper, Pioneer did a paper just back in the fall called Cogs in the Machine. If you do a Google search for Pioneer Institute Cogs in the Machine, it's a, 70-page paper. It's got 500 footnotes. It's written by 2 lawyers who, and not just because we published it, I think it's the best, most comprehensive paper that I've read in 20 some odd years on data collection. You know, I guess the thing that's troubling about it is that under the race to the top, states had to agree to participate in what they call the longitudinal data system. So the feds are prohibited from gathering student-level data on kids, but what they've basically done is enlisted the states to do it for them, and then the states turn them over to the feds. And also through these testing consortia, through PARCC and Smarter Balance too, they are also under obligation to give the data over to the feds because the feds are paying for PARCC, right? And then on top of that, the federal government, the U.S. Department of Education under Secretary Duncan has brushed aside what they call FERPA laws, which are parental privacy laws. And so, to be honest with you, I wish we didn't even have to do this paper. It is creepy to me that people who at the U.S. Department of Education, who over the last 30 some odd years have been really incapable of improving student achievement anywhere, that they need 400 pieces of data on my child to improve student achievement. I mean, we know from Massachusetts and what we've done over the last 20 years that it didn't take lots and lots of either personally identifiable data or lots of non-academic data to improve student achievement. So what's the goal of this? You know, I think the people that are driving Common Core, and it's true of Achieve Inc. and the Governors Association, is that they really have always preferred not a localized, state-driven system of education for citizenship, which is really the tradition in this country. They prefer a kind of workforce development model. And in order to track students to different careers, and the way they do in a lot of other countries, particularly in Western Europe, they need to have all this data. I mean, if you're into centralizing decision-making, You got to have all the data to make that decision, I think. And it's pretty disturbing stuff. I guess the short route to understanding this is there's a woman named Jane Robbins who was one of the lawyers. She went to Harvard Law School, who worked on the paper for us. If you do a Google search for data collection and Jane Robbins, she's on YouTube, and it's gotten something like 50,000 views. A video where she just walks people through what it is that this data collection has to do with Common Core. It really kind of runs parallel to it, but all roads in it kind of lead to a much more centralized view of education.
Okay, so we're going to have two final questions, one up front, and then Shannon will wrap us up.
Has there done any studies on what this is doing to the kids emotionally? Because I'm hearing from all these people and these teachers and some physicians saying that they're getting kids in with all kinds of anxiety and stomach aches and headaches.
Right,
and afraid to go to school.
There's been no interest whatsoever by the USED in the effects on parents or children. There's been no interest by any governor. There's been no interest by any state legislature we know of, by any state board. Parents have been protesting, have been developing communications, sending information around, and absolutely nobody has shown an interest in parents' concerns.
What about pediatricians or something? Could they be in touch with them because they're getting these kids that are in there complaining?
Right. There is a pediatrician named Karen Ephraim, who's in Florida, who has become active and written up information, but I wouldn't know what specific papers she has put out. But she has been looking at children's issues in relation to Common Core.
If we served on Lamar Alexander's committee, that would be a great way for a congressman, man or woman, or state legislator to reach out to other stakeholders to get them on their side to start killing this thing. The argument, if you could bring in a medical argument, certainly anecdotally we see that every day in the schools. And we've heard Peg Lusick talk about it, and other speakers at Common Core Forum has invited in during our speaker series. So, okay, so Foxborough has been a great host. We really appreciate it. Shannon with the final question.
So I think it would be really helpful. I hear from parents a lot as they're sort of taking it all in. They start to get a little confused on something, which is we talk about how we're lowering the standards, but then they're seeing questions or they're seeing homework or they're taking these PARCC tests, samples, and it's really hard. Sometimes it's just confusing, sometimes it's just, this doesn't make sense. And other times they're just, wow, they want a fourth grader to read and comprehend this. And so people don't understand, which is it? Are we bringing it down, or are we...
This is a very good question because it is confusing. What has happened in both math and ELA is that in the very early grades, there are many developmentally inappropriate standards that are too tough for kids, like asking a kindergartner to write a paragraph. Now, maybe the New York Times editorial board is impressed and think, well, this is a high demand, so this is really high-level stuff. But early childhood educators have actually gotten together and signed a petition, 250 to 500 of them, about the nature of the demand, which is in excess of normal development in early grades. But by middle grades, this has become very much diminished, and it ends up being much weaker. Now, that's just the overall trend or profile in both ELA and particularly in math. But what happens on test items is that many of them are very confusing and not direct because they are attempting supposedly to assess what they call critical thinking. But many of the directions and examples are even confusing to educated parents who cannot figure out what's going on. Remember, these are test items being developed behind the board. They have not been vetted by teachers. They have not even been developed or vetted by people whose names are known as professional experts in the content areas, math or literary scholars themselves. So there will be uneven qualities in these test items, but in general, the early grades ask for more than many kids are capable of doing developmentally. By high school, the only way we're going to know, ultimately in English, whether you have a truly high school level reading test is whether the passages come from works that reflect high school level reading. And unless you can find out what they are, how are you going to know? Samples don't tell us. They could be cherry-picked, and this is our problem. We don't know. And they may be deliberately putting out very hard, like Daedalus and Icarus. I saw the one that came out from PARCC. Very impressive, very good. But is that representative of all the others? We don't know. If Daedalus and Icarus, the myth that comes from Metamorphosis, if that is truly representative of a grade 11 test item, that would be fine. But we have no way of knowing.
Just one more quick one? Quick one.
One more quick one, here we go.
Icarus and Daedalus, what is it?
For-profit company is the biggest winner.
I'm sorry, what?
What for-profit company is the biggest winner in all this?
Well, you know, I think that you have to remember, I mean, education in this country is a $500 billion.
One single company.
Well, Pearson, we know.
Pearson.
We know, yes. Okay.
I mean, this is a company that owns, you know.
They had an in right away, and they were
Yeah.
Common Core aligned, producing products everywhere.
Big test company.
And someone
big
from
textbook
England,
company.
what is it, Sir Michael Barber?
Yeah.
Over here all the time. I mean, but there's always somebody making money. I mean, it isn't like this is unusual or different. There's always been people making money, and there have been.
Find that problem, they can't find material other than from Common Core line material anymore.
I mean, look, I work for a free market think
That's-
tank. I'm in favor of the free market, but the reality is that most of the people at the Chamber of Commerce and most of the business people that I've encountered in the last 20-some-odd years, they haven't the slightest idea what kids in kindergarten should be taught in an English class, or really what kids should be taught in high school math. I mean, they just don't know. In the same way that, you know, most English teachers don't have the slightest idea about the stock market or, you know, what have you. I mean, it's just, and that's the thing I guess it's kind of odd, is that you have these big corporate players that are driving a lot of this stuff. They don't have good records in K-12 education and the other things that they've supported over the previous 20 or 30 years. And now they say, this is it, this is the big fix.
Particularly the high-tech companies with the infrastructure for testing. I mean, huge amount of money is going into not only the infrastructure, the technological infrastructure for testing, but the professional development for teachers. Those are the two huge cost drivers. And teachers are now, in one community I read about today, being replaced by mathematics specialists who are being hired to teach Common Core, because the teachers in math cannot teach some of the stuff in Common Core's math. So it's going to be a hugely expensive and more expensive undertaking with fewer and fewer benefits educationally for the kids.
And a lot of the people that are driving this, you'll see this with Jeb Bush, the Chamber of Commerce, about global competitiveness. The reality is, if you look at the records, a lot of people that are driving it, they haven't got the slightest idea what global competitiveness looks like. The only state in the union that can make a claim to having globally competitive students is Massachusetts. And it's really the work of that lady right there. And so a lot of these other people that claim this level of expertise, they're just non-expert experts, is really what it boils down to.
Now, we will not test you on the material tonight, but we will ask you to keep the conversation going. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. We definitely know that this is something that's not going away. If anything, it's just getting started.
Don't give up.
And we don't give up, and we want to we thank our Foxborough hosts and Lisa and the other organizers and your library. Be continued, and we will see you sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you.